Hey everyone, welcome back to another KiteCast episode. I'm Patrick Spencer. You'll notice my co-host Tim Freestone is not with us. He is overseas traveling and hopefully getting some sleep right now, not awake at this hour. That said, we're going in the other direction Tim is at right now, across the Pacific Ocean to Australia. And we're going to have a conversation today with Jacqui Kernot. Jacqui, thanks for joining us today.
So great to be here, Patrick. And as we discussed earlier, I think if Tim, we're all in recovery from RSA, and if Tim's having a sleep, I'm very grateful that he gets a sleep.
Yeah, he was not very wise, I think, to plan a trip to Europe the week after RSA. So a 2-week trip on top of that. He'll be warned to a forever. But there's always Memorial Day for him when he returns. So.
Well, yeah, that is good. I reckon I really would need to sleep for a week after that. It's been, I'm glad I came back for the weekend.
Yeah, I don't do 2-week business trips. I think the last one I did, I was told when I got home, that was you're not doing that again. And I didn't argue. So.
Yeah. Very sensible at home, I think.
So we have a real treat today. And Jacqui, as I mentioned, joins us from Australia. She currently serves as the security director at Accenture for Australia and New Zealand. She's been in the role for not quite 2 years, I think 1 year and 9 months or something along those lines. She has more than 2 decades of experience across a wide range of industries, speaks frequently on diversity and inclusion, cybersecurity, risk, and other topics. And as she just mentioned, she just returned from RSA over in the Bay Area. So she hopefully is over her jet lag by now. And maybe that's a great segue, Jacqui. So I was not able to attend. I had to stay home and help run marketing operations while Tim and others had fun at the event. But you were there. What are, a couple, they say 2 or 3 takeaways that you might have based on what you heard at the event or saw at the event?
So, as we talked about, Patrick, I didn't see you, but I did pat the puppies in the stand. That was very cool, the KiteCast stand. So awesome to do. And look, I think one of the things that was interesting to me about RSA was, obviously everyone was talking about AI, and what became really clear is that AI hasn't fully landed yet, right? We're just kind of starting to get a taste, and it's already what everybody's talking about. But it's the people who are starting to think 2-3 years into the future, which is really difficult to predict, but who are starting to build the infrastructure and the capacity to really make use of what AI can do. They're the people who are going to kind of win, right? And there's some companies that are thinking, really forward thinking around infrastructure. And, it's funny, we think so much now. In fact, I was talking to one of my grads the other day, and I said something about the OSI model. And he said, "What's that?" And I said, "You've just come out of uni, had a master's and a bachelor of computer science." And he reckons they don't teach that anymore. I reckon he might have been sick on the day. Anyway, but apparently they reckon they don't teach it, which is quite hilarious. But, I do think, in today's world, we spend a lot of time, maybe not security practitioners, but we spend a lot of time in that, in the top layer, in the app layer, and we spend a lot of time thinking about social media and all the threats there and that application layer. But, you can't get past the transport layer. It's still really important. And I think as we start to put everything into LLMs and into cloud workloads, to be able to run those LLMs better and access data and transfer it better, and we start to think about how we don't mix data, how we get, whether it's data sovereignty or data control, how we manage all that stuff, we're back to thinking about the transport layer, right? So we're really back at the bottom of the stack. Like, how do countries do something if undersea cables are disconnected and the processing capacity of the AI is mainly in the US, for example, or what happens there? And so I think the people who are seeing the hype, not necessarily feeding into it, doing a little bit of stuff now, but who are really starting to think about how we build infrastructure that will take us into a new era, really, for humanity, frankly, are the people that are going to kind of leap ahead pretty quickly, because what's becoming clear is that very quickly, especially when we start talking about exploding malware, etc., we're going to actually run out of capacity in tokens.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, before we started the actual recording, you and I had an interesting side conversation where we discussed the fact that we really don't know how to plan for the future. We used an example, or I cited an example of one or two of our marketing applications. We're like on the second or third LLM iteration, and we may change again in another 3 months to something completely different. So from a security and governance standpoint, how in the world do you plan for that? Or is there a way to plan for that? And that's probably one reason, there's so much uncertainty out there.
Absolutely. And look, I think we were talking earlier, and our chief AI officer, Lan, who's just, what she doesn't know about AI, I think we can safely forget. It was really interesting to be speaking to her a couple of months ago when we launched our Gen AI studio here in Australia. And she sort of said, if you'd asked me 9 months ago which LLMs we'd be using and how we'd be taking advantage of them and what we'd be leveraging, I would have told you something completely different, actually, to what I'm telling you now. So literally the technology, 3-6 month blocks is changing so quickly, and it's very difficult to predict what to do. And I think that's why, in terms of your question, it's really hard to answer, right? And it's why we've got to be so robust about responsible AI deployment. We use kind of 5 pillars for every AI deployment, but under so many clients are really still at a position of not really understanding where all their data is and what it's doing. And I think, and I hope, we are finally getting to the stage of understanding how dangerous data can be, and that you just shouldn't be collecting it for no reason. And if you do collect it, you really need to think about how you make sure absolutely no one but the right people have access to it, right? And I think, unfortunately, despite the conversations we've been having for a decade, probably about zero trust, we're still probably not there. So yeah, the state of data readiness and governance kind of, worries me a little bit. But we're going.
Well, for good reason.
Age of AI, yeah.
You probably saw the IBM report that everyone releases their reports. We actually hang on to ours. Yeah. We do ours like a month after the our RSA event because there's so much darn noise. They don't pay attention to it. IBM came out with one. And I wrote down a data point here. 24% of projects in this big survey they did, I think several thousand organizations, say their AI projects are secured. So that means, over 75% aren't secured. So to your point, there's a lot of risk out there. You talk to a lot of customers. You guys do a lot of audits and assessments at the same time. Is it just employees being stupid? Lack of processes, and what kinds of data is being exposed, or is it all different types of data?
Oh, look, you've got everything but the kitchen sink. So yes is the answer to all your questions. I think the big thing is that we usually still haven't, most people don't know what all their assets are in a CMDB. If I get to an organization that has more than 70% of its assets listed in the CMDB, I'm like, wow, you are doing well, right? So if you don't even know what you've got kicking around on the network, it's very difficult to make sure that whatever those devices are on the network don't have data in them that they shouldn't have, we went through that thing where we were like, collect all the things, collect all the names, collect all the numbers, collect all the stuff, put it somewhere, we'll be able to monetize data at some point. So we did this big process of collecting it, and we need to do that kind of Marie Kondo process of, if it's not sparking joy now, it probably never will. Get rid of it. But also kind of understanding what you have, who's got access to it. I think the big thing that we still haven't solved around zero trust is identity. And I think that's why a lot of clients are really going into big identity programs, and just, whether we'll ever get a reasonable sized organization's data into a shape that we can reliably, run an LLM across with 100% confidence. I'm doubtful that anybody will ever get to nirvana. Maybe we can ask the AI to do that once it's trained, but yeah, I don't think we're going to do it any other way. But I do think that's why a lot of clients are starting to think, right, we really need to start getting identity right. And actually, interestingly, that's some of the interesting stuff that we see from some of the identity vendors that's coming out. So some of the tools and some of the ones that we've been working on with the vendors actually are all geared around accelerating identity projects, because I think it's not ideal if you've got stuff that you probably don't need and shouldn't be keeping. But at least if no one has access to it, including the AI that's built on the same governance rules, you've got a level of protection that doesn't necessarily make me feel comfortable, but at least it's better than nothing. And of course, there's the other thing, which is just, really making sure, you're the boss of your LLM, not the other way around. So you really need to make sure, as you say, I think you used hermetically sealed container that the LLMs accessed, and I think that's a really good term, making sure that you've boxed it in and really at least run some solid data governance processes against that set of data is critically important. And, really, even if you're not going to deploy AI on anything for a little while, it's, get your data ready is what we're telling people all the time. So unfortunately, then we get a lot of responses back, which is, what do you mean by that? So, but at least that's a good place to start.
Yeah. One of the items, we did a bunch of work around the NSA here in the States released advancing zero trust. Once again, zero trust talked about everywhere, as to how you define that. It varies, obviously, but advancing zero trust across the data layers. And they have 7 different data pillars. And one of them is data tagging and classification, which, we do some in. Actually, we went through all 7 of those data pillars, and Kiteworks enables organizations to align with each of those, which we're proud of. We just published something on it, actually. But if you look at data classification and tagging, what backed identity, I assume that's an important piece of the puzzle of, knowing what data you have and where it's actually at and who has access to it.
100%. So, the 5 no's, if you like, who has access to it, where's your data, is it encrypted, and moving at rest, super important. It's so bad to think that it feels like nirvana, but, because it should just be the base level. But unfortunately, I don't think many people could put their hand on heart and say, I know where all my data is and who has access to it. I think there are some great tools now that are coming out that can help you start to kind of map and classify some of that data for you. And Security AI is one that we use. And I think because of that exact problem space, it's going to be a lot more popular than maybe it otherwise would, because actually no one can see, has effectively identified and mapped all their data. And, data mapping on an organizational scale is a huge exercise, right? It's a computer level exercise, right? I don't know how many security people you'd need to throw at that problem, or data people you'd need to throw at that problem to get that done. And look, the other problem is, of course, we're back to the same old catch cries. We've got no people. There's not enough data and AI people. There's not enough cybersecurity people. So even if you were going to throw people at the problem, where are the people?
Yeah, you may have people, but they don't have the right skill sets. The people you're looking for, there's a finite
100%.
number. Yeah.
So being able to automate some of that is good, I think, if you can find a way to automate some of that. I don't actually see any other way to do it. Like, we've all stored so much data in the promise of data and the promise we could somehow monetize it. I don't know who came up with that, but anyway, I hope they feel sorry now.
Yeah, well, there's no way to tackle today's digital problems without automation. Whenever someone starts talking about manual, it's just, face in palm. No, please don't go there, because you'll never achieve the objective, as you will know. Now, we talked about the risk associated with AI, and it's certainly significant. Did you hear much talk about using AI for cybersecurity for good? Any cool things you heard about? You probably saw the Dark Trace report that came out also at about the same time as RSA, that I think it was like 96, which is no big surprise. 96% of people think that AI will advance cybersecurity in the coming year. I don't know where the other 4% are, but that was not a surprise.
Did not respond to a survey.
Yeah, I guess. I don't know.
Didn't understand the question. So, yeah, look, I think one of the things is that at a conference like RSA, obviously you've got a lot of people trying to get the products bought, which, strongly support. We've all got to earn a living, and that's why we all go to hear about all the new shiny things. I do think cybersecurity people tend to be a little bit obsessed with new shiny things, and I understand the appeal, right? Because I'm one too. But
Yeah.
I do think one of the things we need to think about is how we consolidate and cut down, how we declutter. Like I said, that kind of, the life-changing magic of tidying up, I think it is, isn't it, by Marie Kondo. So we need, I don't know if you got that Netflix special where she goes around and cleans people's houses. Apparently her house isn't that tidy now either, but so maybe...
Yeah, it's
so
grown.
maybe it's the same.
More money.
Yeah.
She bought more stuff.
Yeah, exactly. So I do think we need to do kind of a lot more cleaning up and shutting down than we do buying some new stuff to do new stuff. However, I think obviously at a conference like RSA, you're going to hear about how amazing it is and how it's going to transform it. And I actually spent a bit of time amusing myself going around stands with, AI enabled. I'm like, well, what do you mean by that? What are you actually doing? What's the AI bit doing in it? And actually, fewer than 50% of the people could answer the question effectively.
Yeah,
so I think,
Yeah.
I think, I don't know whether they just had terrible people on the stands or whether their product's not really doing much actual AI. But I do think there are some really promising technologies starting to come out. And as I said, what I think is critically important is actually the people who are starting to think about the future power of it and the capacity. And we spoke to Google actually, and we had some really good discussions with those guys. And the way that they are thinking about planning and capacity. And one of the interesting things that struck me is things like, we're seeing a lot of carriers and things looking at undersea cables, how they have resilience and backup, because they don't want to be necessarily disconnected from some of the processing capacity. As they start to plan data centers, they've started to run, these AI-enabled data centers, which, and Google's actually, after the Aurora attack in 2009, they've actually built it, rebuilt from the ground up their hardware. So they run custom hardware, right, to run these data centers. That's really forward-thinking in terms of understanding how to build this. And they said they, built a whole data center, which sounded terribly wasteful, but probably true, and then realised that actually the physical power that it needs is like to the power of, it's an exponential power requirement on the basis of the data center capacity once you start using all this, really leveraging the AI and running, huge numbers of tokens. And so, they basically had to, like there's a data center, they had to go, right, well, we just can't actually get the power to that. It's pretty much useless. We've got to rebuild it, start again, right, and run more power to it. So they're not sure what they're going to do with that one, but the new ones are built with this incredible power capacity, right? So that just the physical limits of this stuff is immense. And I think I haven't seen many vendors actually thinking that way. Like, how do we plan for the physical limits that we're going to need to push? And look, maybe quantum will assist with that, right? Because it'll give us that processing capacity. Yeah. But that's also extremely power intensive.
And then, you saw the latest ChatGPT release, which I downloaded the same day or started using it, and it's 3-4 times faster than the ChatGPT release 4 release, and probably the next one in 3 months will be 3 or 4 times fast. So perhaps those, along with quantum, will help us overcome some of those power challenges, because those have not been figured out yet, to my knowledge anyway. I haven't seen.
No, 100%. Yeah, and I think that's the problem. We haven't really started to think about the physical limits of what we're going to be able to do with it, right? And so, if you take, reverse malware engineering or malware sandboxing, for example, and you're trying to exploit some malware, you don't want to have to break it into parts and explode it in different sandboxes because you haven't got the capacity. Because that won't give you the true reflection of what it's actually doing in the network. So to be able to kind of explode the full chunk of malware in the same space is so much more powerful, right? And it's going to be much more effective at actually reverse engineering it. So I think when you're starting to plan for capacity, say you've got 5 bits of malware you want to exploit at once, right? How do you actually get that done, right? So hopefully quantum will bring a new layer to that kind of physical requirement. As you say, I don't know what the capacity of, the physical capacity requirement of the new ChatGPT is, but, even then, what happens if that gets cut off and we're all using it? You start to think about those, and maybe by force majeure, right?
I can't do my job, I hate to say, in marketing today. If ChatGPT and Claude and some of the other, Perplexity, they go down, we can't do our job. I have to go get a cup of coffee and wait for it to come back up again. That's where we're at today. So, we need to figure out those challenges, obviously. And, we still have, I listened to a podcast last night. I think they're spot on, where the smaller organizations are so much more agile. They're able to embrace AI much faster, and we still have way too many, and they do a lot of, on the marketing space, consultation with the Fortune 500 companies. There's so many of those that have not pivoted, that are still doing things the way they were doing things, pre-November 29th or whatever the date was when ChatGPT 3.5, the advanced version, that came on the market. So it will be interesting to see what transpires there. There was one other transit. We could talk about AI forever, obviously. There's
totally. And look, to be honest, I think enough people are talking about AI. There's probably other things to discuss.
Yeah, we talk about AI in about every podcast. I think it's inescapable, just because of how ubiquitous it is today, and it's top of mind of all the thought leaders we talk to. If you looked at the Verizon report that came out, I wasn't surprised because we watched this. In fact, I did a webinar with our chief product officer and Charles Mandiant, the CTO over Charles Carmichael over at Mandiant. I'll get it right yet.
Yeah.
Charles Carmichael,
I knew who you meant.
Yeah, dyslexia, I guess, or something. On all the NFT breaches that happened last year, and they were all over the Verizon data breach investigations report, as you probably saw. And it's supply chain related. And we see more and more, particularly the nation state attackers, but also some of the sophisticated cyber criminal groups figuring out that, one-offs, they don't get them that far. But if they go hit one of these software supply chains, suddenly they can attack hundreds, thousands of companies and access millions and millions of actual records, which has happened with the MoveIt breach, and even with the Go Anywhere breach, it wasn't quite as large, but it was quite substantial. The Verizon report showed that 15% of all the data breaches last year were related to the supply chain, a 68% increase. So, what's your perspective on that? And is that threat also real in Australia and New Zealand? I assume it's a global threat. It's going to be the same here as it is in Australia and New Zealand as it is in the UK.
Absolutely, 100%. And I think here our regulators have, financial regulators have been really focused on supply chain risk, and we've been seeing more government regulation come out as well as from the regulatory bodies like APRA. So APRA's CPS 230 and 234 legislation here are all about supply chain risk and kind of understanding, what they call third-party risk, but supply chain risk largely. I think we're seeing a bit of focus on it, but I'm certainly still seeing low maturity levels across, non-financial services companies. And I think that's problematic, right? Because, one of the dynamics that you alluded to with supply chain and some of the other stuff we were talking about is that we are all becoming so interconnected. Even like separating LLMs can be very difficult, right? Depending on what data you're using in it. So, sometimes we can be our own risk in supply chain, if we're running that. So I think there needs to be a significant amount of focus on supply chain risk, and really the amount of money that various companies are spending on it. We really need, I was talking to the minister a while back in the consultation process, and over here we have, I don't know if you have it in America, but we have like a heart foundation tick for things that are low cholesterol and good for your heart. And so food products have, the heart foundation tick. And I'm like, we actually just need a, good, better, best kind of T-shirt sizing for suppliers, and everybody just needs to fill that questionnaire out once, and it needs to be comprehensive. The fact that we're all designing separate programs and there's no standardized supply chain, management and risk quantification processes, we're seeing actually one of the things that another RSA thing, and perhaps, another dynamic is we're starting to see the rise of automated risk quantification tooling, which is really good, because I think the amount of risk that sits in a supply chain versus the amount of risk that sits in the business, people sort of seem to rate it as less than, but depending on how interconnected those systems are, and as we start to automate more with AI, we're exposing a lot more risk. Things will be faster, services will be faster, but the risk increases exponentially when you add 100 suppliers to that, data set that previously perhaps only 5 had access to, in order to speed up transactions, for example. But, it doesn't just reduce the risk or increase the risk by 5%, it exponentially increases the risk, right? It's, when you've got 100 suppliers, it's the risk goes to the power of, not just, 5, 100 minus 5, so it's 95% more risk. Like, it's not at all. And I think really there has been a very long history. I had a military past, and, damaging the supply chains is always a great strategy, right? From the 15th century, and the situation's no different, really. If it's too hard to get into a supplier, even if you have a robust, to get into the original organisation, utilising the supply chain is so straightforward, right? Especially because you can usually tell by the products and services offered that supply chain facilitates, just how interconnected those systems are. That's easy for an attacker to work out.
Well, like
from
about
the internet.
Hannibal. Yeah. He didn't have a supply chain because you couldn't extend it over the Alps. He got to, over into Italy and Rome, and, he muddled around there for 3 or 4 years, but without a supply chain, he finally ran out of gas and had to go back to Carthage, and the rest is history.
100% right. And, I always think these lessons are very old, but we need to learn them, right? And so this idea that your supply chains, not to worry, you don't need to, it's less than the risk to your organisation. I mean, that's the way people that will get in. If you harden yourself really effectively, then people will go, great, we'll get in through the supply chain. And even now, third-party contractors, etc., are the easiest way to get into an organisation, right? So managing, physically those people, managing, what they do on the network, etc., because, they are part of the organisation, but not in the same way that a full-time employee is.
Verizon
those things are
87% of all data breaches are tied back to, guess what, end users. Now, it didn't. It would be interesting. Hopefully, they add it to next year's report. What percentage of those end users are actually outside of the organization and third-party contractors or partners, or in something you're going, the 4th level of the supply chain, 5th level, and so forth. There's been a couple of interesting reports over the past year actually on that, but it's the weakest link to your point, is the actual human component.
100%. And look, I think one of my dear friends, who's Janine Budget Forrester, has been really working on human risk management, and her work is amazing, and the depth to which she goes. But it's amazing how little we focus on human risk management, and how we focus on people who are tired. Which post-COVID, everything's accelerating, things are pretty hard, the market's hard, economic conditions aren't great. And I'm not ashamed to say, a shout out to Chris Burkhardt, our CISO, who designs great phishing programs with his team. And I did get phished yesterday with an internal program, because they sent me a thing about some rewards I need to spend before the end of the quarter. And I thought, someone's given me some rewards. No, they hadn't. But I'm back from RSA and I'm tired, and it's not that I'm not educated, but I'm trying to chew through all the stuff, catch up. I'm tired. I've got a bit of jet lag, and of course, so the amount of focus that we need on that human risk management, and how we manage burnout, tiredness, the inability to actually really focus on one thing. It's not like I need to do more security training. I'd argue that's not the problem, and all the indicators were there. It clearly said external, blah, 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 and our rewards thing doesn't come from an external thing. But, when you're trying to run through things quickly, it can be tricky, even for the most educated user. And so I think how we focus on managing, risk quantification in that human element, how we not let people get too tired, how we, don't give them difficult, complicated things to do without support, so that, when someone socially calls them as a social engineer, they think, oh, this is another of those difficult things that I'm supposed to do without support that someone's asking me to do from somewhere I don't know. But this time, actually, it's someone socially engineering their credentials, right? It's we make life complicated in the era that we're in for humans in the space, and they're under a lot of pressure, and they're worried about things like economic conditions. So how do we support people so that they make better choices?
Yeah.
In terms of work. I don't think we think about that type of thing enough, and I think it's something that Janan's research is really bringing to the fore. But I hope we start to think about it more, because 83% of breaches through human vectors. I'm surprised it's not higher, to be honest. We have got some really good security products and tooling in place, and humans are a lot easier to get access to these days.
Yeah, there's that social engineering element. You can't socially engineer responses typically out of a machine, to your point. So that's
exactly.
So, on that topic, and you have a lot of experience in this space as well, and in Australia you've had IRAP here, and usually it starts at the government level. You have CMMC here. You've heard a lot about that over the past year, and it's going to start to have some teeth. You have certification programs like SOC 2, and then you have FedRAMP or FedRAMP moderate. There's FedRAMP high and so forth. Can we begin to implement security protocols and standards? You have the CISA thing that's very high level, obviously, that was signed actually at the RSA event. We were one of the signees. But to get more granular than that, you start to dive into 110 controls or 300 controls or whatever might be the case. Will that help us to mitigate some of those risks in the supply chain?
Look, I think regulation always helps. I'm a huge fan of regulation, because the reality is there's a bazillion things to focus on, and until we get regulated, we often don't think about things, even sometimes if we know that they're key risks, right? So regulation really helps to solidify that in people's minds, and I think and bring that attention and focus. I think that's important, and it also brings the top-down focus, which is super important as well. I do think that regulation and frameworks have a limit, largely because often, the struggle for compliance creates people who are more focused on compliance than the problem, or, a situation where you're so focused on compliance, you can't focus on the problem. And certainly, when we look at crisis response and resilience here, we've added a lot of regulation in a short time. Arguably, in Australia, we were under-regulated. But, and it's great that that's quickly happened. But it was really interesting to hear in some of the breaches that we've had, some of the large breaches, that because of the overlapping legislation, it's quite difficult to work out how to comply or how to actually run the business in the event of a breach. So one of the organisations, I was talking to the lawyers who are kind of helping them manage all the ASIC regulatory halts and trading halts here, and they would do a mandatory notification to the Australian Cybersecurity Centre, which of course is a good thing to do, and there's a time frame on that. And then, half an hour later or 15 minutes later, they would get a call from ASIC. It would go, "You've been on trading halt for too long, start trading again." I'm like, "We've just sent the ACSC notification. No, this is going to kill our share price. Can we let it rest for 45 minutes? And ASIC's like, "Nope, you can't." And so now they're looking at whether they actually make those mandatory notifications perhaps not public, so you can privately do it to encourage people to really report. But a CEO who's already in the middle of a massive crisis is dealing with the press, and he gets the lawyers saying to him, "You've got to," ASIC's telling us to start trading. You've got the level, the CISO sort of saying, "I've got to report to the ACSC. I've got mandatory reporting." There might have been other kind of mandatory reporting things. There's something like 45 different regulatory reports you've got to do within the first 72 hours of the crisis. Some CISOs were telling me, I won't quote that number because I don't know if it's been quantified and true, but it's in that vicinity. That is a lot of regulatory reporting, and you've got all sorts of different people who need to do it. And the poor CEO at the top is going, I've just killed the share price of my company. Like, what? I'm going to lose my job. So he's got all that existential angst, and the board yelling at him, hopefully not yelling, but probably not happy, who he's got to kind of brief and manage. That is a lot for any group of humans or one human being to be focused on and manage. And so I think how we simplify reporting and regulatory frameworks and think about, I think the way that we think about security and look, just the way we operate in corporate life anyway is quite individual. And I think what's really becoming clear, in Australia, we say cyber is a team sport. And I think there's a lot of individual collaboration between security people. But until we start thinking about how we manage a lot of this regulatory framework stuff together, how we share data on, suppliers or make it easy to digest. So not everybody has to run a multi-million-dollar third-party supply chain program. How we kind of have a professional framework and certification for people is really important. I actually had a funny conversation with one of my mates who heads up Army intelligence here now, and I was talking to him about doing some stuff, and he sort of said something, and I said, I'll have to get my clearance back. I don't have a clearance at the moment. And he was horrified. He goes, what do you mean? How do you have any assurance? How can you be doing what you do with no clearance? And I'm like, well, you only need a clearance for government work, right? But, and of course, it's I kind of made a bit of a joke. And I said, well, you've got a lot of cleared people who seem to still be getting pitched by foreign intelligence services, mate. So I'm not sure that's actually going to fix the problem, but which you agreed might be true. But it is a really valid point, right? What's our certification process for people, right? Unless you are actually sitting under a clearance framework or one of those regulatory things. And we see it all the time. The number of, there's so many conversations about things like TikTok and Temu here. And internally we're having one about whether we should ban it, which I'm every time I get on a call with the Australian team, I'm like, just ban it, just ban it, stop.
Move on.
Just move on. And they're like, well, Jacqui, there's some nuance there. And I'm like, no, there's not. Get it off. Like, if it's an Accenture-owned device, just no. And so luckily that idea seems to be now carrying. But if we look at all the ways that people are to be socially engineered, I was talking to a guy who's doing a lot of operations out of Papua New Guinea at the moment in the Solomons. And he was saying people are kind of handing out free phones, because that go back to, Huawei devices and that sort of thing. So there's a lot of collection attempts going on, right? And if you take someone who, for example, is a VCISO, for example, this kind of thing that we're doing with a war for talent, where we're having, interim CISOs and people contracting into businesses. I mean, if you could get one of their devices, you could collect a lot of information, right? If you could collect on them or socially engineer them somehow. So I think we're going to have to see some kind of process that's a broader framework around people, because, the level of collection activity going on broadly, globally is pretty hectic.
And certainly much being talked about on that front, to your point. It's a risk.
Well, it's interesting. Yeah. Well, that's it. Sorry, I didn't interrupt, but our Director General for ASIO here, Mike Burgess, has been, did a National Press Club speech and has been talking about it quite a bit, that, he's getting really frustrated, and I understand his concern with, people putting, I've got an NV2 clearance on LinkedIn. It's like, mate, get that off. Like, please don't make it easy. So you've got this incompatibility with people who are trying to be employable, etc., but who are then exposing themselves to, kind of collectors, etc. It's really tough.
Interesting.
And then you've got your kids who all want to download these apps. And I had a funny joke, which I actually did do this. My daughter came in grade 4 and sort of said, Mum, like, I want to have TikTok. All my friends have it. So I rang the school and I said, I'm going to do like a cybersecurity talk for all the parents at the school. And we had a chat about the evils of TikTok. And I came home and I said, there you go, honey, I fixed it. And she's like, I can have TikTok? I said, no, none of your other friends have TikTok now either.
It's all been banned now.
She wasn't very happy with me, but it got the job done. But, not everybody has that option, right?
So, and we're almost out of time. One last question for you here. I'll combine like three of my questions I had put together beforehand into one. When it comes to the skills issue, you mentioned, going to the school to present and so forth. How are we going to solve that? Because we do have a lot of cybersecurity professionals out there, but they may not have the right skill sets that organizations need today for the gaps they're trying to fill. Are we going to fill that with mentoring and coaching a new generation? Are we going to do it? You've done a bunch of work around diversity and inclusion. Is that another area? Is it going to be in the universities? How are we going to fill those gaps from a security skills standpoint?
And look, Patrick, I think, I could write a book on this topic. Maybe I should write a book on this topic. But in fact, there are books written on this topic, actually. Jane Franklin, a good friend of mine, has written a book called Insecurity, which is a really good book on exactly this topic. I recommend you read it. But I do think our industry has to become more inclusive. I don't think we're great at that. It's been very male dominated. And the other thing that struck me that a young graduate when I was working at Telstra said to me is she did telecommunications engineering, and she said, there's no sexy engineers in movies. That is not they're the weird guys in the corner in the movies, yeah. Right? I think maybe the girl with the dragon tattoo created some noise, but I do think how we look at people being depicted, etc., in the media and real life, I think we need to really think about making career roles and stuff more visible, because I think until we make, there's been a bit of a funny thing about making, I always laugh that we make kind of cybersecurity into a dark art, which is really good because it helps us all get paid more. So I'm totally in support of that. But we might have pushed it a little bit too far, right? It's actually not an arcane art. There's lots of different roles in cybersecurity, some of which can be filled by reasonably non-technical people. And,
exactly.
Frankly, the training I had at uni at computer science, I'm trying to think of, I did first year computer science. My degree's actually in biochemistry. I seem to have muddled through quite well. And there wasn't a degree in cybersecurity. So, because I'm that kind of, I'm carbon dating myself now, but, what I learned then is largely immaterial now. I can't remember if there's much that I would have learned.
Any of those who are getting cybersecurity degrees today, what they're learning today, probably in 3 years is going to be immaterial as well, because things change.
Exactly, 100%. So I really wonder if universities are the right place to teach it, just because of the model they apply, right? That 3-year degree, residential on site. The other thing with university is it, fundamentally applies, reapplies privilege. And I have a strong problem with that, because we really need people who can think differently, who can think like attackers think. And attackers are not usually white rich people in first world countries, okay?
Yeah.
So you actually really don't want those guys doing resilience and defense, because maybe they can learn some of the tactics, techniques, and procedures, but whether they can really put themselves into the attacker's headspace, why would they do that? What would they go after? You need people who think like those people. And these are all concepts we've known from, military models for ages, right? When you go to a conflict in another country, the first thing you do is pick up some people who can speak the language and who can explain customs and how people do things and that sort of thing. And so, if we don't start to attract a broad range of people, our defences will be ineffective and will be constantly surprised by the new techniques and tactics of attackers. And so I think it's kind of an existential threat that we really start finding a way to reduce the privilege, entry requirement into cybersecurity. And I think we need to think of ways to do that structurally. And we need to think of ways to get, free training to people and help them understand it. And we also need to role model and make visible different people in cyber. Most young women, for example, don't necessarily want to go and join a big group of men. Like this young graduate was telling me, I think she was the only telecommunications engineer in like 100 blokes, and her parents were like, went to the opening thing and they were like, honey, are you sure this is what you want to do? And she was having doubts herself, right, when she saw how
male-dominated
there's no other women in the room, right? And certainly for me, I'm used to that. Like I kind of tell a funny story about how it was 2 years before I went to a meeting with another woman in it. And when I did, I got such a surprise, I thought I was in the wrong room. And I actually said, oh, sorry, I think I've got the wrong room. And she said, no, you're here for the authentication meeting. And I said, yeah. And she said, great, I'm Lisa. and we're still friends today. She's still in cybersecurity as well. But, that's 2 years without seeing anyone that looks like you is a very long time.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
one hope that we would see some change, back when I was running a publication at Symantec, I would interview a lot of women CISOs actually for the publication. But that was a rarity. I think we were just fortunate. They were the thought leaders in the space. So those are the ones I interviewed. And we thought, because of that, we would see more progress. And it almost seemed to go backwards, a few years ago. I don't know if we made any progress after COVID, but we certainly haven't seen a whole lot of progress over the past 10 years. So lots of work to do. Lots of work to do.
Yeah. And I think making those people a lot more visible is really critical, right? A critical part of what we have to do, because we've got to amplify that, women who look like X can do. Someone who looks like you can't be what you can't see, as they say. And I think that's a really important tenet to remember. So it's not necessarily that we're giving, women CISOs unfair exposure. We need to level it up so that we get the right diversity. And that applies to all diverse minorities. I don't know. It's actually funny at EY, actually, I got asked we had a whole program to get neurodiverse graduates on board. And, we had this kind of interview set up and everyone joined, and there was a bit of a cast of thousands. And I thought, this is a bit weird. And then I'm like, where's the candidate? And they said, oh, no, this isn't the interview. This is us explaining to you how you have to do a neurodiverse interview. And I kind of laughed and I said, I work in cybersecurity. I have interviewed quite a few neurodiverse people. Are you kidding? I think I'll be okay. It was great that they were doing that training, but it was kind of a bit of an eye roll. But how many leaders are actually out as neurodiverse people and feel comfortable to say I'm neurodiverse, and how we, despite the fact that it's a bit of a hidden secret that we've got a huge chunk of our industry, I think far more than the normal 20% of the population are probably neurodiverse in cybersecurity, and probably, broader computer science generally, IT. I think, it's kind of a running joke, but yet we don't necessarily have many leaders calling it out and saying, this is what I'm role modeling. And so I think that happens across all diverse minorities. And we need to start getting structurally better at that, because it's not about our individual journeys. It's about making sure that people see a role model and they see someone they can look at and connect with and feel that could be them one day.
That could be
and
me
so we need to think
years.
about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a good
And
point.
if they don't see that, they make a different decision when they're in high school. And I think we can't afford for that to happen. We can't afford to lose those bright people that might think about a career in cybersecurity or something that would facilitate, positive change in our industry, but they decide to do something else because there's just no one that looks like them and they can't see how they could ever be that. So how we solve that is an interesting question, but I think every company really needs to commit to a level of structural programmatic change.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's funny because, on my leadership team, for example, it is diverse. I've got one man and the others are women. No. I kind of laugh that I'm like, you're my diversity pick, mate. And I think what's interesting about that is the reaction from the market. the number of people who think it's quite strange, who comment on it, and I'm like, actually, guys, this is in reverse. This is what happens in most teams, and it's just normalized, right? So it's really interesting to see the market reaction. And look, I haven't necessarily picked X or Y. I just, pick who's the best candidate. But,
Yeah.
and, I find a lot of women have had to work a lot harder to get where they are. So, your bang for buck is pretty impressive, actually. But it's really interesting to see that even in 2024, what people think about that is, it's really shocking and surprising. And a 3/4 female leadership team in 2024 shouldn't be that horrifying, really. So, yeah, I really hope one day we get to, these things are pretty normal.
Yeah. Yeah. And it can be in certain areas, but it isn't in cybersecurity today, as you well know. So, well, we could go on for another hour or two talking about different topics. In fact, I think of the topics I wrote down that we could cover, we got to about half of them. So we're going to have to do this again, Jacqui. I really appreciate your time. I know our audience is going to find this podcast quite interesting. Tim missed out on a great episode. He'll have to listen to it now.
Thanks, Tim, and thanks, Patrick. Really appreciate it. It's been great having a chat.
Oh, thanks. For those who would like to check out other episodes, you can do so at kiteworks.com/kitecast. Thanks for joining us. Look forward to the next conversation.